Today we're gonna go over and rank all of the handheld consoles that I own. And to start things off, we have to talk about the Game Boy. Now I have a heavily modified Game Boy Color here, but let's just think about Game Boys in general, you know, the old monochrome screen, Pokémon, Tetris. This is really where I got my start in gaming. Granted, I had a Nintendo Entertainment System, whatever, fine, great. The Game Boy is where I spent a lot of my time. And that was essentially because I didn't have to fight over the TV. I'm gonna put these on a tier list. It's gonna be D for the worst and S for the best, so it's D, C, B, A, S. And as far as the Game Boy is concerned, I am sticking this console in the S, the top slot, because honestly, you can't fight with that much nostalgia. And speaking of nostalgia, next up on the release is the Game Gear. Now, if you ever had one of these, you know that it took 6 AA batteries. Now, I know the Game Boy, the original one, took 4. I understand that's a lot of batteries, but something about 6, when you're a kid, that is hard to come by. All of that being said, the Game Gear is one of those consoles that I just loved when I had it. I had a lot of Sonic games that none of my friends had. I was enjoying this thing. It was huge. It was ridiculous, but it had a lit screen and it was like having a TV in your bag. I know that's like nothing these days, but back in the day, having a game that had a backlit screen on the go was a huge deal. But again, the batteries did not last long at all, and to have to get 6 every single time, it was a tall order. I want to put this in the A column, but given some of the consoles on here, I think it's going to be my first B. It's right in the middle. It's got nostalgia going for it, but otherwise this thing is unruly. And now that brings us to the Game Boy Advance SP. Now, I don't have my original Game Boy Advance anymore. This is actually not even my original Game Boy Advance SP. I had to buy this one later in life. But the Game Boy Advance was like having a Super Nintendo in your bag, and now the Game Boy Advance SP is even smaller, and it's got a clamshell design so you can literally stick it in your pocket and not worry about scratching the screen. I mean, look at this. It's perfection. And yeah, the original Game Boy has the original Pokémon games, but the Game Boy Advance had some of the best handheld Pokémon games yet. Specifically Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Now, I know that's a legendary game on its own, but my attachment to that game is much deeper than just how good it is. Every now and again, my family would go to Pennsylvania and we would visit some family, but there was a flea market where we went. And I had my Game Boy Advance on me at all times, and I wound up making friends with some kids who were playing Pokemon. So whenever I think of my favorite times playing Pokemon, I always think of the Game Boy Advance. It's going in the S column, and you can't change my mind. You can comment about it all you want, but I'm not gonna modify my list. And that brings us to the next console, which actually scared me when I found it, and that's the PlayStation Portable. Now, this console was great, but the thing that scared me the most was actually the state that one of my batteries was in. When I opened this up, the battery was just fine, but it turns out that there was another battery in the package, and it basically exploded. The battery pack essentially cracked over time. I guess it started swelling up because it's lithium ion, and that happens sometimes, but none of my other consoles from yesteryear did this. Only the PlayStation Portable's battery. But like I said, nothing really got damaged, and I did have a separate battery, so let's actually talk about the console itself. One thing about the PSP that always boggled my mind, even back then, is that they made these things called UMDs that went into this. Let me see if I have one. Here's Daxter on the PSP. This was actually a spin-off game in the Jak and Daxter series where you play as Daxter as a bug killer, and essentially you were sticking like a tiny CD within your PlayStation Portable, and then there you were on the go playing with a disc drive console in your peg. I'm sure I can revisit some games, but between Daxter and Crisis Core on the PSP, I didn't really have a lot more to do with it besides maybe some portable ops action, but I wound up playing that on the Vita, but we're not there yet. Anyway, I'm gonna rank the PSP at a B for now. I'm sure it's got more potential than I allowed it. Moving on to the next consoles, the first of many Nintendo DS iterations, and we're gonna start with the Nintendo DS Lite. Now, granted, I had a Nintendo DS, but I think I sold it for this console, but there was a good reason for that. First of all, this is a lot smaller than the Nintendo DS was, which I am grateful for, but also it can still play Game Boy Advance games, which was something we wound up losing as the DS line went on. As far as form factor goes, it was great to have a smaller console, but I was really frustrated that the Game Boy Advance slot was made in such a way that the GBA cartridges would stick out the bottom. They just made it that much more annoying to try to play older games on here, and for that, it gets a solid A. It would probably have been an S because the DS is a solid console regardless. those. And speaking of which, we're gonna talk about the Nintendo DSi. Now this console is everything the DS was, plus a camera, which at the time didn't really make a ton of sense. Like we have a camera on the front as well. It's a solid console. It fits right in the bag. It closes like a clamshell. We love that. However, they did remove GBA compatibility with the DSi, and for that, it gets a B. And now the PlayStation Vita, and this is one of the better handhelds to have ever existed. I remember enjoying this console a lot. It did a lot of weird stuff. One of my favorite things about the PlayStation Vita is that this back plate is actually a touch sensor. Only a few games took advantage of it, Tearaway being the one that comes to mind right now. You would stick your finger on the back here and it would make it look like you were sticking your finger through the world in the game. The screen is gorgeous. It was an OLED panel back in the day that was pretty rare, so to have a screen that nice on a handheld was a great choice by Sony. Everyone always uses the Vita as the example of what Nintendo could have been doing the whole time with the Switch. I still think that the Vita on its own stands in the S column. I think this is a wonderful handheld. And the next console is a console everyone knows and loves, and that is the Nintendo 3DS XL. I'm gonna take this thing out of the box so we can look at it together. I remember when I bought this console, I was crossing the street where I live and I said to my partner, I think I need a new 3DS. And she was like, okay. And then I was like, I'm gonna get the Hyrule Edition 3DS XL. And I wound up using this thing almost every day for commuting. It was my go-to console. It still feels so solid. Just holding it right now makes me a little nostalgic. It's, in my opinion, the perfect size for any handheld console. I think that the only reason I stopped using it was because I didn't want it to break, because it is a special edition and I loved it. And I knew that 3DSs were gonna start being slowed down in production. So I said, let me put this one to bed for now and save it and buy something else. This is the Nintendo 3DS XL Super Nintendo Edition. I bought it because I just liked the way it looked. I barely used it. I'm just keeping it as clean as I can for as long as I can. I'm sure I'll wind up using it at some point. I have no attachment to it other than the fact that I really like it. Nintendo 3DS XL gets the S tier. This is a solid commuting console. So yeah, this next one will wrap up our Nintendo 3DS journey. If it's not clear, the 3DS is one of my favorite consoles ever. So when this one came out, I was very excited. One of my biggest gripes with the handheld market right now is how big these consoles are getting. We'll talk about specifics in just a minute. And while the screen looks great, it just wasn't as big as the 3DS XL screens that I had now grown accustomed to. If I had it my way, this would have been the only size that the 3DS ever released at. That being said, this particular console has a swappable faceplate, so if you kept these, this is a cool way to customize it and have fun with it. The buttons themselves are colorful. Everything about this is just a joyful experience. I mean, it feels really nice in the hand. I'm gonna stick it in the A column just because I was pampered by the bigger screens of the 3DS XL series. Okay, so there's technically one more 3DS, but this is actually a 2DS XL, so it's not exactly the same. They took out the 3D feature, which I always hated in the 3DS. I never liked having the 3D screen. It doesn't have any wrist strap loops. I'm a clumsy person. I need to be able to loop my wrist strap in, such as I do with this console or the 3DS. I would love it to be an S. It goes in the A column because I'm gonna drop it. And that brings us to the Nintendo Switch. I don't love considering this a handheld. I mean, yes, it is a handheld console. You can throw it in your bag. It loses the portability that we have grown accustomed to with almost every console up to this point. But as far as the Switch goes, obviously it's an S tier console. Some of the best games ever have been made for it, but we're talking about handhelds. And as far as that goes, I'm gonna stick it in the A column. I love the OLED screen. I love the games on it. Yes, it's portable. You can bring it with you, but you can't toss it in your bag for a quick walk or a trip to the park, something like that. It's not that kind of handheld console. Before this video, I was looking for this thumb drive and I was like, where did it go? It was in this box. Why did I put it in this box? Maybe I should use the loop to wrap it to my wrist and then I won't lose it. Anyway, finally, we're gonna close this up by talking about the Steam Deck, which when you look at consoles, the handheld market, I wanna talk about where it's going. This is a giant, is it a good console? Absolutely. I love the Steam Deck. I get a little weirded out by thinking about putting this in a bag for a trip. Maybe I'll bring it to a friend's house so we can play some Steam games together. But as far as a traveling console, I'm not throwing this in my bag to go on a commute. I don't know if I consider it like a portable handheld. It's a handheld. You can hold it with your hands. I love the way I use it. I use it in here with the dock, and then I have another dock in the living room. So all in all, It's been very useful, but as far as portability goes, you know, we're looking at like the Vita. It's a B. I love you, Steam Deck, but you're a B. I'm sorry. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I have all my handhelds out now, so now I'm tempted to try new things with them. Like maybe I'll put some cool new software on my PSP, or maybe I'll find a way to make the Vita make more sense. Maybe I'll check out why this is swelling a little bit. Maybe the battery needs to be taken out. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.